Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Thornton. I'm the senior editor here at Open Minds, and welcome to today's Circle Executive Roundtable, Rethinking Your Business Model for Strategic Organizational Redesign, featuring Open Minds Senior Associate Ray Wolfe. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping reminders. Your audio is muted for today's briefing. However, we do encourage you to submit questions. You can use the question box located on the right side of your screen. If time permits, we will answer those questions after the presentation. And finally, the slides and the recording for today's roundtable will be archived and available for elite members on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. And with that, here's Ray.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ray Wolfe, and I think I want to start today by apologizing. The title for today's session is a brainstormed sentence that was probably 2 or 3 minutes from the really good one that would have developed if we had thought it better. This rethinking, its redesign, organization model, just all these key words. And I wanted to try to convey what I actually think is going on with this and what I wanted to talk about right up front so we can eliminate a little bit of that confusion. What I'm concerned about here is the fact that I do not believe, after research and review of a lot of key business articles, that we are designed correctly to make the kind of changes we need. That there are simple, easy, transitional ways to rethink the core elements of our system and to rethink those in ways that will open them up a bit and potentially make them more fertile ground for the changes that we want to see. Internal reorganization may make change management, mergers and acquisitions, changes of service lines, integration, much more effective and efficient than they've been in the past. And I'm really hopeful that will be the case. I'm hopeful because in experience, I used to work at a very large community behavioral health center / IDD / homeless / veterans program in Pittsburgh that was very aggressive and innovative. But I always felt in my time that I was there that about 2/3 of everything we did failed. That we either didn't follow through because we found out it didn't have the value we need, or something else came up that drew away our resources and time. And I really have been focusing over the last year specifically, watching some of my clients go through change initiatives or attempts to restructure their organizations or merge. I've watched this with a sense of pain about the way things were for me previously and how we probably are not as effective as we should be in understanding that change is not as easy as we think and that we have to learn to live with certain levels of problems. The fact is, those levels of problems exist everywhere. When I started this research to find out if there were ways I could help clients to enter into change initiatives more effectively or to begin to see their company in new ways, I started to read some of the literature, and what I found was very depressing. McKinsey did a study about 10 years ago, and in that study, they determined that 70% of all mergers fail to meet their goals. Now, don't fail as in the companies were disrupted or ceased to exist, but the merger was less effective and produced less results than what was expected. When I looked at that number, I was kind of shocked. But then I followed that up and found out that there was research from Harvard Business Review. There was research from Stanford and from other organizations, including Deloitte, that kind of reemphasized that point. And one of the key things that I read was about not mergers and acquisitions, but change initiatives. And when I got into that reading, And this was a particular article from Harvard Business Review. I found that they also had a failure rate of, guess what, 70%. So when you look at that, you've got to wonder what's going on. And in our environment, we've got to be more than a little bit concerned. I think all of us understand the feeling that things aren't headed the right way. If you look back over the last 5 years and you see where you were and you see where you are, you have trouble drawing a line 5 years forward in many cases. You have trouble seeing how the present structures that exist for most of the nonprofits in our industry can be sustained for any real length of time. So with that, we ought to be feeling a sense of urgency, and many of us do, but that urgency is often very much offset by a sense of depression or hopelessness that we have because we see it heading the wrong direction. We don't think that the kind of change we need is indeed possible. As a result of that, I don't think that we as an industry are as aggressive as we could be. And I think that organizational redesign is a methodology that we could use to make change a little bit more successful in our environments, to open up our cultures and our organizational structures to easier and more effective processes that will build that theme that we want over time. The truth of the matter is these 70% numbers, they came from the commercial side. They didn't come from the complex care market that we see or that we are dealing with. When you look at that complex care market, there's even more reason to be hesitant about making change. There are good reasons why we shouldn't do anything if we are logical. For example, upside benefits are questionable. Yeah, Pepsi Cola, Ford Motor, Texaco may well find effective ways to find something new that creates a 25 or 30% margin. No matter what we commit to or where we move, it's difficult for us to see margins that are anything like that or that really will substantively contribute to our well-being. Secondly, we may get a lot of startup money and a lot of cost covered in some of these initiatives that we began, but those incentives are all short-term. Truth of the issue is building doesn't mean it can be sustained. And I see this with many folks today who are anxious and interested in CCBHCs, but whose states have pretty firmly committed that they're not going down that road. So yes, there are 2-year and 4-year grants that would be available that could move you in the right direction, would benefit your community, but the likelihood of your being able to sustain them are probably pretty limited. Secondly, these efforts require a lot, and we don't have the resources. And as compared to before COVID, when we talk resources now, we're talking about staffing, administrative talent, management resources, primarily because all of us are facing the fact that those are much rarer and much more difficult to maintain and sustain than they were before. Yes, cash is still a problem, still an issue for most of us in this area, but these change efforts can severely tax these resources when other smaller opportunities might prove better. We all know that the downside risks are large. Stresses on boards and staff can be more than bearable. You can break significant relationships, including some that could cost you your job. Finally, the truth of the matter is that many of the local folks who use our services, many of the local bureaucratic people that we deal with on a daily basis, many of the local insurers and employers that we work with really don't want to see things change. They've developed relationships with us that are comfortable and traditional, and They, along with our consumers and staff, become very anxious when they see us move into big upheaval level change and tumult. So the question begins to develop in this. What are we doing? Why are we beginning to look at change in the first place? We know we're in a disruptive industry. And as we look at that industry, what we begin to see is that right now is really the time we need long-term commitment and strategy and change management. It's during periods of this kind of disruption that long-held assumptions begin to change and that strategic thinking becomes more important. The middle sentence here from Stephen Bungay, who I quote frequently from Harvard Business Review, this is his article about the 5 myths about strategy, was very important to me. It noted that strategy is not about the long term or the short term, but about the fundamentals of how business works. It's not about a new project, bricks and mortar for a new building, a new relationship. It's not about a merger and acquisition that we get completed. It's about the sources of value, the drivers of and the cost to deliver it, the basis on which we compete with others for reputations of quality that allow people to be attracted to us. If that is the case, and what we're really looking at in terms of strategy begins with the idea of internal change, begins with who we are as a company and as a people, then to get a grip on that, it isn't about looking out 3 years and developing a project plan. It's not about how long we think, it's about how deep we think. Far from being about things in the future, strategy is about decisions we make now and how we can shape those decisions and thoughts into positive steps in the right direction towards our themes. So if I had to sum up what is organizational redesign in a brief segment, it would be organizational redesign is about thinking the very, very core basis of your company in a way that is like a follow through with a golf swing. And it will make your strategy, regardless of that strategy, go higher, farther, and faster with a more reliable and consistent outcome. It's the process of reconstructing and reconfiguring the structures, the processes, the way people report within an organization, how they view leadership and follow roles. All of those need to be aligned with themes that we think are more 10-year long, rather than strategy plans that have specific landmark results at the end of 1, 2, or 3 years. Specifically, let's look at those things that we never look at, that we assume there's only one way to do, that we assume are just standard ways of doing business. They are not in many cases. So one of the things that I want to do is look at the legal muscles of the company. How are you organized? What are the options for that organizations that might be more attractive to you? And in fact, far, far, far easier to implement. What are the processes that people follow? How do we manage individual performance? What are the elements of the ways we recruit talent and develop employee skills? And what's the culture behind that that drives it all forward? So what I want to do today is kind of inwardly think about the way our companies operate and the way we can develop and build them out. So with that introduction, I'm going to start with 3 or 4 elements here that I think are going to be effective in helping us look at our companies and the way we can slowly and easily change them over time to align more with the strategies that we're building on a 3 or 4 year basis. One, the lawyer in me wants to start with legal structures. I'm sorry about that. I've never really given up that segment of my life or sense of understanding. I think our corporate structures are horribly underused and not at all effective. And I think a portion of that is the way we look at them. So I want to investigate that with you quickly and spend maybe 10, 15 minutes in that area. Staffing and reporting is where some amazing changes are taking place. I want to investigate new options for the traditional hierarchy that might yield greater satisfaction, effectiveness. I want to tell you about some examples I've seen of people who are moving away from the traditional hierarchical structure with effective results, and how you might see those examples as ways to potentially pilot with a small number of staff a different way of thinking about leadership and structure. Thirdly, we need to think clearly about culture and process. One of the elements that I want to repeat to you later at a different point is simply this, that we talk about changing culture, and in some ways it may be easier than we think. In other ways, it's far more difficult. And in many ways, it is terribly interrelated with our legal structure and our staffing and reporting in ways that make it essential we do all three at the same time. The culture changes that I am thinking about in terms of flow and process and staffing and development, I think are interdependent in a unique way. The more unfettered, the more we move away from micromanagement, the more responsibility and empowerment we give to employees, the more we have to be strict about certain cultural elements, particularly around the ways we develop new procedures and new processes within our company, because those traditional forms of binding everything together won't be available to us. Finally, I'll end up with some quick tips and hacks about things we might think about or do in this process, but kind of let's quickly move along to legal structures and think through what we actually think of as the legal structures for the company and how they tend to work. When I see us today, one of the things I see, and I know this is a stereotype, but one of the things I see is that people believe that organizational structures are really bipolar. It's a light switch sort of thing. Either you are an isolated independent, or you are aggressively merging and attempting to develop merger relationships that completely change who you are legally and who someone else is legally, and there frankly is no in between. What I see as a lawyer is those two extremes represent maybe 2 or 3% of the total kind of options that are available for us as we move ahead. And maybe our industry would be better off looking at those options that lie between isolation and merger and seeing those in a new and different way. Let me, if you'll forgive, let me start with my understanding of what a corporation is. This is kind of law school, corporate law 101. But the organization is a lot more powerful and a lot more unique and capable of a lot more innovation according to the laws of your state and structure than you may think it is. First off, they live forever. Nonprofits are generally managed by self-perpetuating boards or groups of people that can appoint those boards. I know clients I have refer to themselves as owned by a county or a governmental entity. That's not legally or technically probably correct. They are still managed by a nonprofit board. That governmental body simply has the power to hire and fire the board that they have under them. In that regard, no one single life, no one single person manages or controls the board. The board and the board controls the company, and the company lives forever. Secondly, corporations have enormous powers because under our laws and legal system, the infamous Article 1332, a corporation is a citizen. It is a citizen of the state, and it has the same rights, responsibilities as other citizens. It is a separate legal entity in the same way you and I are. It is empowered to make any contract or develop any relationship that you and I would make. Debts, judgments, and liabilities belong to the corporation and not to the individual board members, because it is a separate entity making its own way ahead, even if the board is guiding it. And unless it comes to serious fraudulent or illegal activities or failure to pay payroll taxes, which actually occurred to me once in long ago in West Virginia, there are very few ways that people within corporate entities can in fact be significantly impacted. They are free to move with respect to their judgment in the correct way that they see. Can they be sued for making a bad decision? No. The truth of the matter is that there are legal shields in every state which protect board members from actions that don't work out the way they had planned. Some states use a Good Samaritan rule. That is that because they're volunteers, they are not held to a standard of negligence like other people might be, that they can operate in good faith without fear of liability. Some states, like the state of Delaware, have adopted what is referred to often as the Delaware rule, where even with the benefit of hindsight, a board member cannot be sued, or an executive of the company can't be sued unless they didn't investigate correctly, or they didn't learn the details of what they were doing. The end result of this is that any sort of major action that is well documented in the minutes in terms of the material that was passed out to the board, the opportunities they had to review it, the time that was available for them to discuss it, anything that has that kind of structure around it in the minutes of our board meetings really means that the board and the board members share in a pretty substantial barrier to being sued or having actions taken that would be negative to them personally. So, one, you've got a more resilient structure than you may think. Two, you've got a structure that is based on personhood, citizenship. And as a result, there are very few limits to what a corporation can do or contract for, or the kind of relationships it can build. Just like any of us, it is open to what it finds most valuable and most meaningful. I've used this graphic on numerous occasions. I'm sure some of you have seen it. I spent some time trying to come up with S words to fill the middle, but the point of this is simply that a corporation can act in numerous ways and through numerous structures, and it can be a low level of integration or a very high level of integration or anything in between. Mergers and acquisitions are what we see at the far end of this. Mergers and acquisitions are a single leader. Two go in, one comes out. It is a structure that is very high in terms of short-term risk, as compared to those who see the company as isolated and independent, which I believe is a very high risk over the long term. So we developed a model here where we are accepting two very high risk models when there are so many middle paths, as the Buddha would say. Let me walk you through some of these just to give you an example of what companies can do. You can develop clinically integrated networks without giving up any powers to your board, your own tax exempt status, your own ability to manage staff, make your own decisions. These networks can be created in such a way that, with the good advice of a lawyer, you can actually use this entity to negotiate contracts with managed care entities. in ways that won't violate antitrust laws. You can create associations in this area where potentially you can have groupings of very influential nonprofits working together on a single goal. All of us are probably members of trade associations, but those can operate on local levels to help with community-based projects, to impact the community in joint ways, to work with local departments of health or insurers in ways that create all sorts of activities. And those associations are pretty darn free. They are a few words in an email and a pressing of the send button away from your being in or out. No responsibilities, no end, you walk away. Management service agreements are a little larger, a little more structured, but basically you can buy technology services from another entity. You can sell technology services. You can share and create all sorts of structures that will allow you to use computers that are expensive for many small organizations to buy to address issues such as the EHR. You can share finance departments. Many people are moving in areas right now that allow them to get through that huge upfront barrier that is startup cost in technology. Most of us know that on the other end, the monthly charges are fairly manageable, but oh my gosh, getting through that front barrier is difficult. We can build ways to do that together. We can have joint operating agreements and joint ventures where each of us will share in a new program or new project that we can share in the profitability, we can share our skills with, and it'll benefit both of us in terms of referrals and in terms of other processes. The most common thing I refer other corporations to in my corporate client work is the idea of membership substitution or holding company. It's a systemic approach to linking two corporations, but both retain their independent status. Both very clearly have all of their licensure, all of their contracts remain in place. None of their executive positions are eliminated or restructured. One company simply takes more responsibility than the other. It appoints board members or does things along that line and becomes a parent to a subsidiary, but within certain parameters, both stay independent, happy, and focused on their mission. Only at the far end of this do you see mergers and acquisitions. Legally, we talk about collaboration. What we really mean is M&A. M&A has very specific legal meanings. In a merger, company A and B come together and an entirely new company is created. When a merger happens and it is a true legal merger, both companies cease to exist and a fully new company is created. This is a baby. It has no contracts, it has no licenses, it has no regulatory approvals for any of its structures, and it needs to be able to get those in place long before it will be able to bill. Merger is something that is best done over a long period of time in order to make sure those things don't leave you in a cash flow crunch. But you can just generally assume that all the insurances, payer contracts, regulatory licenses, all your staff credentialing must be sought as if the service is brand new. Substantially good reason in that to be looking a step downward at more systemic membership substitution kinds of structure. The acquisition isn't much better. The acquisition is a company A and a company B. Company B ceases to exist. Its legal relationships, its structural problems, all of its assets and its liabilities become part of A. No, A does not have to get new contracts. It doesn't have to get new credentials and new licenses. But everything that B brought to the table will have to be changed. So when we use the word collaboration, let's be clear about what we mean, because the high end of this spectrum is pretty harsh in terms of short-term risk. I wanted to give you a good example of what a membership substitution looks like. It's a negotiation that builds a bridge between a parent and a subsidiary. The parent wants certain things and it gets them by changing the bylaws and articles of incorporation of the subsidiary. The subsidiary has to vote generally around 3 areas. First, they have to vote to allow their board members to be appointed by the parent corporation's board. They can still have their own board, but the hiring and firing of that board is now owned by the parent. Secondly, at least on terms of big things, the parent has the final say. Approval of budget is one. Every year's budget should be approved by the subsidiary board and developed by the subsidiary's finance department in conjunction with all of the program leaders of the subsidiary. But in the end, there's a presentation to the parent board to gain a final approval. Capital expenses need to be reviewed by the parent over a certain threshold. I know in Pittsburgh, we were owned by a corporation in Michigan that was associated with the Catholic hierarchies in the country, and they had a standard of $2 million. Anything over $2 million, we had to get approval of our parent board. Actually, I thought it was beneficial. It was great when I was looking at something big or expensive to have other eyes on the project, to get the views of someone who was far more objective. But there ought to be some level of capital expense that's appropriate for the two companies that the parent would be involved in. Thirdly, there is generally some appointment or approval of a CEO. The subsidiary in this negotiation negotiates for trademarks contracts. They keep their legal entity, they keep their licenses, they keep their boards, their staff, their leadership and control, but they reserve specific rights, and they can be whatever they want. I've seen these structured that the subsidiary got the parent to agree that they would continue the golf tournament that raised money for the foundation. And things as simple and basic as that can be written into the agreement to assure the subsidiary that the kind of future they want is possibly there. Don't be surprised if a subsidiary looks at this board appointment and says, that's fine that the parent board will put 3, 5, 10, 12 people or have complete control of our board, but what if we wanted to put 1 or 2 on your board? Is that possible? Legally, it is. It's up to the negotiation and to the two parties that are trying to build that bridge. The end result of this is that although the negotiation is tough, the transition is near seamless. Everybody stays reporting to the same people, the same projects continue, the same contracts that we talked about with folks are still in place, and the entirety of the organization and often the organization's trademark remain in place. We have assured continuity of operations while basically consolidating resources to give us a bigger say. Other options. A nonprofit can own a for-profit subsidiary. You can have your own employment agency and work directly through that agency with Walmart, Best Buy, any number of places that you can create employment opportunities for people. You can run your own lawn service, you can run your own restaurant, and many do. Unless it becomes a major material value to the corporation, a for-profit subsidiary is fully allowed in the relationship with a nonprofit. Corporate associations are tax-free if they exist for a 501 level kind of activity or process. So education associations, associations for the development of communities, are places where you can join in with builders, schools, academia, hospital systems without sharing any of your own process. I mentioned independent practice associations and the way they can negotiate. The only place I see a lot of barriers, and this comes from the federal government, is how do we relate to FQHCs? The FQHC regulations require community involvement, and they define that very specifically. A majority of the members of the board must receive services or be representative of individuals who receive services. It must be demographically inclusive and ethnically inclusive in terms of race, ethnicity, and sex, and comparative to the region. That generally means that a mental health center cannot take over an FQHC, although the two of them might want to build a board that looks like that, and the two of them merge together or incorporate in other ways. Traditional M&A with an FQHC doesn't work. My final thoughts in this area: A and B can come together and create a company that owns them both, and both of them put 50% of their board on that new company. They would keep their own local board, but have a big say in the company that owns them. This works out better than membership substitution when the two companies are roughly equal and they don't want to see one of them as the parent or subsidiary. Joint ventures happen when two companies share some resources that might be of value. A and B create a new company. They're allowed to, they're citizens. They can create this new company, which will have the rights to move into a community and do additional work. Maybe B owns land and A has skill sets that could work in housing and development. All kinds of activities could operate in these sort of mechanisms that will keep us moving effectively and well ahead. Anyway, corporations can create new corporations. Those new corporations and their relationship to the prior ones is entirely up to the structure of the corporation. 4 reasons that collaborations and mergers are working more today than they did when that 70% rule was in place was that acquirers are learning more from doing and are integrating more rigorously. There is a stricter due diligence, but I want you to think about that first segment a little bit. Mergers are working because they have coming with a broader scope. This is counterintuitive to our industry, but that friend of yours that you've been working with for 30 years and now he's approaching retirement and you're thinking about merging because your two companies have always been friends, that merger may have more risks than you moving outside of the mental health spectrum and merging with a food bank or a housing developer or a provider of speech therapy or some other structure in other ways. Broader scopes tend to work better in merger and acquisition processes and in all corporate realignment. Staff and reporting. We all know that if we were to take a picture of our staff reporting, it would be a lot of boxes. And those boxes would be job descriptions. And with those boxes, we would have little lines that connected them. And we would see which boxes are higher up the page than other boxes. And that's how businesses work. Except that's not how businesses work much anymore. There are organic reasons why those boxes really don't tell you the truth in the first place. First off, small businesses are more flat and they require a different kind of individual. The person who succeeds in a small business is someone who's willing to do multiple tasks, who's willing to step in when Jane is on vacation and cover a payroll or cover timesheet management or be available for staff problems in a certain program. Those kind of people are highly valued, even though their skill set is very broad and maybe not too deep. As companies become bigger, the organization gets taller, more vertical levels, and those levels are more segregated by function and by skill set. Suddenly you have not just the IT guy, you have the technology department. You have multiple areas of expertise within each administrative area, and you have key levels that allow you to look ahead at other things that and do planning with some level of organizational understanding. There's an unconscious bias in our industry that makes us top heavy, that has us hiring more managers and supervisors than we really need. And let me walk you through it. And I think that each of you will probably see that there are, in fact, perfect examples of that in your own experience. One is each grant is a subdivision, and therefore each grant requires a manager. If you're getting a grant, you know the first thing you do is put in the salary level for the person who will manage it. And each of them, regardless of their size at startup or regardless of their size years down the road, has a separate subdivision. As a finance guy, I'm going to tell you the finance department owns this problem big time. Back in the day when cost centers were vertical and charts of accounts were horizontal, we had to create cost centers for everything we needed to report. So there had to be a cost center for the do something good in the community grant, regardless of its size. And in that process, we created a structure where managers now don't have an equitable amount of material below them. Secondly, we loudly say each site needs a manager, and if each site needs a manager, that manager needs a series of supervisors, so it's impossible to run a shift without a supervisor. So regardless of whether it's a 3 or 4 person home, we should be looking at 4 or 5 supervisors and 1 manager in order to get things done. Not necessarily true. One of my favorite is the number of supervisors we dedicate to therapists who are probably the most trained and most independent practitioners of anything in our industry, yet they require intense levels of supervision. Clinical supervision is not organizational supervision. A person who may need a mirror to reflect on when they are talking about their treatment plan or talking about a particular approach with a client really doesn't need excessive amounts of help when they're planning their vacation or their days off. We need to be able to separate thinking about those two in ways that allow us to make our management leaner. I have seen this much, much more in the distant past than today, but working many years in Pennsylvania, there was a state financial scale, and that scale applied to all positions. And if you had someone really good, really that you didn't want to lose, the only way to keep them and to get their salary up was to give them a new and higher titled position. And often we created someone under that position simply because they were there. Management reflects funding streams, program types, specialty. All of this plays into the fact that we, frankly, are too management heavy at the top. Our systems are too big and developed inappropriately. If we look at it again, I would ask the question, how many managers in your system have a span of control? By that, I mean a number of people that they supervise that is 6 or 7. That's kind of where it needs to be. And if you did that, then 3 layers below the leader, we ought to be looking at 220 people, and the 4th layer would take that up to 1,300 employees. So 3 or 4 layers of management should be sufficient for any organization, regardless of size. Yet we continue to have C-suite, vice president, division manager, supervisor, and often team leaders below that. Fewer layers are simply more conducive to vertical communication. They're more conducive to distributive decision making. They're more conducive to an increased sense of staff importance. They frankly don't give the supervisor or the leader of that unit enough time to become a habitual micromanager. It is interesting, if you're facing financial difficulties, to take a look at your number of supervisors. Think through issues around, what do you expect a supervisor to do or not do? Did you make someone a supervisor simply because they were a great clinician and maybe missed out on some of the supervisory or management skills they needed? Flattening your hierarchy is probably more than just a cost-saving skill. Yes, it's traumatic. Yes, it's difficult. But on the other end of that, it creates an organization that is more nimble and more responsive. A lot of people now are working in teams. I saw this work effectively when one of my wonderful young supervisors in Pittsburgh kind of built this structure for therapy. Our therapy department, when we became the CCBHC, broke into units. One of them was responsible for geriatrics. One was responsible for SPMI, one was youth, one was substance abuse, but each of those teams contained a doctor, a nurse, 3 or 4 or 5 therapists, a case manager, a clerk, and all of them worked together in that structure to plan their week, develop their resources, and work together as a team without anyone really knowing for sure who the actual leader of the program was. That structure, I think, is far more conducive to attaining good talent and retaining it over time. It is more agile, it is more decentralized, and it creates opportunities for amazing levels of innovation. Our geriatrics team was, for example, not in the building as much as they used to be, because they developed relationships with larger nursing homes and were spending days in facilities where no-show rates were non-existent, doing work with people who really needed it. The team concept is a way to move away from the idea of a single unit that is only doctors or only nurses or only therapists, and to create some functionality around that process. Something new that I haven't had much experience with, but I think it really matters in our industry, is the Helix model. In Helix, there are 2 managers. Leadership 1, or leader number 1, oversees supervision, hiring, firing, scheduling, business requirements, and is responsible for the general reporting of operational problems and managing of the employee and performance reviews. They set the standards on how the work is done. They make sure the facilities are clean and neat, and that the client experience entering those facilities is solid. Leader 2 drives professional excellence, their strategy, their innovation. This is the place maybe for clinical supervision to be placed. Each of these leaders, because their roles is different, can be filled by a true specialist. And those 2 trust specialists, if they can work together, can manage 15, 16, 17 people in an appropriate model where each of them is more coaching than directive, and each of them is providing assistance to the employee in a different way. It feels like, if I use a word from our industry, feels like a wraparound to the employee. Their needs are met. They know who to reach out to for what. They don't fear some leadership intervention when what they want is really some understanding of how better to engage a customer. There's value to be created, I think, in that model. Both of these models can be flatter. They can be more flexible and dynamic. They can, if given the authority, create much more innovative programs. They can feel like home and be a stable place for employees to ensure long-term career satisfaction. It is also a way to tell people they are appreciated at the bottom end at the grassroots level of the company. They are also edgier. In that, I mean, they touch different places in the company and get that information back to leadership in ways that you would have never done through traditional hierarchical methods. And that communication system is actually been tested and proven from business perspectives. All of this, of course, impacts the building blocks of the company, the DNA. Decision rights, you have to make an objective, open, concrete decision about what can be decided at what level, how much financial authority a supervisor has, what ways they can change or innovate their department, whether they have a responsibility to refer it to a higher level for decision or simply talk it through, whether that talk it through means that the supervisor decides or that talk it through means that the originator decides. In this process, decision rights become less important than information. Where originally we taught supervisors, or they thought their role was the decider in a company, what their role really is the information gatherer. We have to figure out what the motivations are. And frankly, there are a lot more motivations than money. Thank goodness, because we can't afford the money. But status, a few attaboys, some thank yous, a reward dinner, ideas of career ladders change when you change this teamwork structure in ways that I think make sense and motivate people differently. What the final model will look like can be decided over time, but what the goal is has to be clearly defined and coherent. I mentioned information gathering belonging to the leaders. Here's a model that you can draw down. This is how I would train a supervisor to make a decision. What are the goals that need to be met? How does the opportunity fit our overall vision? What's the biggest risks and negative? What will it take to obtain the people and talent we need to get there? Now with this in picture, how can I prioritize this? Who do I go and talk to about it so I can get a so what response? And finally, are there hidden reservations that people haven't talked about in this flow? This kind of process was, I think, far more important than having a leader who is making a good decision, is someone who can show up and in 4 or 5 sentences give you this kind of fact summary with respect to an opportunity. Lean Six Sigma and the lean movement have changed healthcare, and we are behind. I would strongly urge everyone to look at the Six Sigma process to determine that flow. And as I said earlier, the more loose we become with decision making, the more we try to empower people down at lower levels of the company, the more the way we change processes and procedures needs to be adapted. And that adaptation needs to involve very clear structures such as Lean or Six Sigma that tell us exactly what the words are, exactly what the tools are, and everyone has the same meaning and can communicate effectively. There's no way for cross-functional teams to be successful in any kind of environment, even the most hierarchical, if in fact they don't have some standard working rules, what they will do when they look at a procedure and how they will change it. Employee engagement is a great thing. I would simply throw in one caution that frankly, empowerment increases retention, increases satisfaction, increases motivation, but it doesn't always boost routine staff performance. So there remains a place in this middle ground for traditional objective supervisory work and performance review. One of the ways that I would change radically, and I'm a big proponent of, is the elimination of the procedure. Do you remember the procedure book, the standard format with the title at the top and the number and the reason and the purpose and the people involved, and then a very clear linear one-by-one, step-by-step approach to how the procedure would be done? Frankly, not effective in training, not effective in getting things done. And those big books are, in fact, a little too cumbersome. Flowcharts are much better. Flowcharts produce little green boxes. Everywhere there is an employee that has something to do, and that box has an input line and an output line. You know where, if you are in that box, if that is in your swim lane, as we would see in this particular graphic, you know exactly who is going to provide you the information to start your work and where it will go when you end. Rather than a linear chronological listing of goals, we do boxes, box checklists. And this checklist will simply list all the things that need to be done. As people get more adept, they'll do them in their own order. Person comes to the front desk and the first thing they say isn't their name. They start talking about how far away they live, and so it's easier in engaging them to ask for their address. It doesn't have to be linear. It should be engaging, but it should be completed in totality. And as a result of that, I think what you need is to be able to know that before I move things to the next box, I'm going to check all of these boxes and make sure they're all taken care of. The training process for this is substantially easier and more logical, and it seems like in many ways it begins to flow better. Some final thoughts with our last 5 minutes. One, this doesn't replace strategy. This is just a slow, incremental way of rethinking our organizational structures so they're more open to change. Think about more alternatives for relating to people through your nonprofit. Think about different ways of managing people for their own satisfaction, or to develop teams that might create better outcomes and more effective approaches to dealing with specific kinds of issues in your community. Think about a culture change that is more rigorous about procedures, but easier to train and more nimble and more able to be adapted as changes arrive. Think in terms of themes, not goals. That's the focus on the long term. These 9 elements are not, in fact, linear, but it's easier to think of them in phases. Focusing on the long term, consider a theme. What do you want to be like in 10 years? Not, do I want to develop a comprehensive integrated system, but I want to be able to have better relationships with primary care and have that part of my offering. I can build that a million ways. Addressing immediate pains and dealing with strategy might be helpful in the short term, but over the long term, that 10-year theme is probably easier to communicate and better understood. Take time before you announce it to develop it well, and very carefully create that blueprint. Think beyond the lines and boxes in terms of the kind of people that will be needed to create that theme. If it's a new product or a new process, do I need a team approach rather than a hierarchical approach to that development? If so, what should it be? Look at and find those challenging mindsets and begin to deal with them. Communicate and communicate the compelling reasons, not with a sense of failure, but with a sense of, we're still going out this direction. We're going to keep moving in that direction. It's a success if you've tried. Finally, be fair in allocating of resources. One of the things I've noticed within some companies is there's a sense of problem when things have developed that are inappropriate or that take too many resources away from them. This is something, if you're planning over 10 years to make this kind of change, or 6 or 7 years, I think that makes a lot of sense. Every change, of course, is not a new plan. The one thing I would add to this, be aggressive with the passive aggressive. Make sure there's commitment to the process and to the long-term communication. Know you're not alone. 60% of companies have begun redesigns in the last 2 years and 85 in the last 3. Change is about future and not present failures. So when you think about this in terms of this flow and process, please Think long-term, make it align with your strategies and your short-term goals, but keep it focused on that long-term vision, which you continue to communicate strategic plan over strategic plan. Thinking this way in the long term, I think, will have beneficial effects for our industry and will make it like the golf swing to go higher, faster, farther in terms of our change efforts. I want to make everyone aware that May 9th from 1 to 2, June Simmons, the President and Chief Executive Officer from Partners in Care, will be here to talk about rapid social care delivery systems and their evolution. And we'll talk about a case study that happened within her foundation. With that, we have completed the hour, so I want to thank you all very much for your attention, and we will be signing off. Corey, any final words?
Yes, Ray, I want to thank you for your presentation. I also want to thank everybody who joined us. Ray told you what we have on deck next week. And if you would like to register for that event or to look at a full list of upcoming roundtables, you can visit the Executive Roundtables page under the events tab at www.openminds.com. And lastly, I want to remind everybody that the slides and the recording for this will be made available on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. Ray, thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Corey. Bye-bye, everyone.